40-year-old Andreas, deeply depressed, waited for a subway train to approach and took a fatal step. In the next scene, we see an empty lot with a single building. An unknown man has hung a banner on the building that reads, "Welcome." Soon a bus arrived at this remote station. Andreas was the only passenger, unsure of how he ended up there. The bus left. The man warmly greeted Andreas. The banner, by the way, was specifically for him. They got into a car. When Andreas asked where they were going, the man replied home. By evening they arrived at some city. The man handed Andreas the keys to his new apartment, announcing that he would now work as an accountant at a large firm. Andreas agreed to everything he was told, utterly confused. The apartment turned out to be spacious, furnished with everything he might need, including clothes. Andreas still didn't know why he was here. The night was sleepless. The next morning, Andreas went to work and met the boss, Howard, who seemed very friendly. Howard introduced Andreas to his colleagues and showed him the office, as well as his workplace. Andreas started his duties. During the break, he stepped outside. This unfamiliar city seemed perfect. The streets were clean and tidy, and people in business suits with briefcases hurried about their day. Suddenly Andreas' eyes fell on a man, who judging by the scene had stepped out of a window to voluntarily pass away. People in gray arrived and took the body away, while cleaners erased all traces. After work, Andreas relaxed at a bar. The other patrons were making small talk among themselves. No one danced or partied. In the restroom, however, Andreas encountered a man who appeared quite drunk. Andreas commented that the alcohol here seemed watered down. At least he didn't feel intoxicated. The drunken man and another patron began complaining too, saying that everything had lost its vibrancy, alcohol didn't cause inebriation, and the food was tasteless. Andreas headed home and along the way, heard music coming from the basement of one of the buildings. At home, Andreas ate his dinner. The food truly had neither smell nor taste. The next day at work, Andreas accidentally, or perhaps deliberately, lost a finger. His colleagues tried to assist him, but Andreas kept insisting that no one touch him. Later, he woke up in the same vehicle that had taken away the man who had voluntarily passed away. The people in gray remained silent. They drove him back home. Removing the bandage, Andreas found his finger intact. But how was that possible? At night, Andreas again couldn't sleep, unable to understand where he was and why. The next day, he went to the very place where the bus had brought him. At that moment another person stepped off the bus. Andreas was determined to leave this strange city, but it seemed there was no way out. The city was surrounded by an endless desert. Later, Andreas went to work. All his colleagues behaved excessively friendly, including his boss. Andreas felt that something about this place was fundamentally wrong, and that feeling intensified each day. Life here was too idealized. People spoke only on superficial topics, showing little emotion. Andreas accepted Howard's invitation to visit his home that evening. On his way home, Andreas hoped to hear the music again from the basement near the office. That evening, as planned, he dined with his colleagues. There, he met a woman who sold furniture and invited her on a date. And Britt gladly agreed. Howard raised a toast to them all. Andreas walked his new acquaintance home. And Britt was passionate about interiors and design. Andreas didn't expect her to invite him inside that night. It seemed his monotonous life here had finally gained meaning. His romance with Britt progressed rapidly. They even started renovating her home together. Soon Britt introduced him to her family. All conversations at the table were purely superficial as well. Life here is overly proper and dull. Even though Andreas now lives with his beloved, he feels that she is actually indifferent to him. And Britt cares about nothing except the renovation. Andreas sinks deeper into despair. Returning home from work, he is constantly forced to talk to Britt about the renovation. At the office, Andreas met an attractive woman named Ingeborg and began openly flirting with her. Lying to Britt that he would be working late, Andreas went to the movies with Ingeborg. While watching the film, he couldn't hold back his tears, whereas his companion showed no emotion. Afterward, Andreas walked Ingeborg home. She thanked him for a lovely evening. This turned into passion. Ingeborg wasn't the least bit embarrassed that Andreas was in a relationship. Andreas was willing to do anything to feel something, to receive some emotions from others. From that moment, Andreas and Ingeborg began secretly dating, but he grew tired of hiding. After a workday, Andreas decided to confess to Britt that he had met another woman and fallen in love. She reacted with complete indifference. Britt was only concerned about their guests coming on Saturday. Andreas agreed to stay until Saturday. After keeping his promise, Andreas went to Ingeborg to surprise her. Without giving his beloved time to change, he took her to a luxurious restaurant and announced that he had broken up with Britt. He expected a more joyful reaction from Ingeborg, but it didn't come. Ingeborg said she hadn't planned on a serious relationship because she already had another man, actually two. Andreas couldn't judge Ingeborg, as he had been living with another woman when they started dating. Andreas hoped that Ingeborg would choose him, but she stated that those two guys were also nice. It seemed she didn't care who she was with. This broke Andreas completely. Next we see the scene from the beginning of the film. Andreas stepped forward as the subway train approached. Despite his fatal injuries, Andreas somehow survived. In this state, he wandered the empty streets of the city until the people in grey took him back to Ann-Britt. She acted as if nothing unusual had happened. Andreas' wounds healed quickly. Now he knew for sure that there was no way out of this place. One night he heard the music again, coming from the basement. It awakened a sense of something alive, something real in Andreas. He decided to find the source of the music at all costs, and it led him to the basement where the man he had encountered earlier in the bar restroom lived. The man was clearly not pleased to see a visitor, but Andreas couldn't leave without finding out what the music was. The man warned him not to tell anyone about it. The music was coming from a hole in the concrete wall. Peering inside, Andreas saw a faint light. Since then, Andreas has not been able to stop thinking about it. Howard noticed that something was bothering him. Andreas shared that he was surprised by the fact that there were no children in the city. Howard clearly didn't want to talk about it. Later, Andreas called Ann-Britt and told her he would be late at work. She didn't care. In reality, Andreas returned to the basement and started hammering at the wall, determined to reach the source of the music. It was not easy, but Andreas was not going to give up. The man tried to stop him, warning that they would be caught. But Andreas knew for sure that they had nothing left to lose. At one point he smelled something coming from the hole in the wall. The man began helping Andreas make the hole. The music and the light ahead gave them hope for a better future. When Andreas arrived at the office, he was surprised to see another man sitting at his desk. Howard announced that Andreas was fired, hugging him and wishing him good luck. Andreas began to be frightened by the people in grey, whom he frequently saw near the office. He tried to avoid them. Now he dedicated all his time to chiseling through the wall. This attracted the attention of the elderly residents from the neighborhood. The men managed to break through the wall to a place from which happy children's laughter could be heard. Smelling something real for the first time, the elderly wanted to see what was inside, but the man drove them away. The tunnel led to a cozy room. The moment Andreas tasted a pie with a real flavor, the people in grey seized him and the man, who kept repeating that it wasn't his idea. They were taken away in the grey vehicle. Eventually the man was released. Andreas, however, was brought to the local council, which determined that most people here lived happily. Andreas was placed in another vehicle while the people in grey sealed the hole with concrete. Andreas was driven back to the same bus stop and dragged out of the vehicle. Soon a bus arrived, and an elderly woman stepped out. The people in grey shoved Andreas into the machinery compartment. The journey was long. During this time, Ann-Britt had already found herself another man, as had Ingeborg. Life in the city continued as usual. After hours of rough shaking, the bus stopped, dropping Andreas off in a snowy desert. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel not to miss more exciting new products. Also, the authors will be pleased if you leave your opinion in the comments.